Hey everyone. So as you may have heard, we are launching a new podcast under the Global Dispatches brand called To Save Us from Hell. It is a weekly chat show in which my co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I discuss the latest news and happenings from around the United Nations and the broader UN system. In lieu of a regular Global Dispatches episode, I am sharing with you the debut episode of To Save Us from Hell. I am so excited about this new show. If you're a regular Global Dispatches listener, To Save Us from Hell is a bit different. It's not an interview show like Global Dispatches. Rather, it's a chat show in which Anjali, Dayal, and I give our own takes and opinions and views about happenings around the UN. Anjali Dayal is a UN expert and professor of international relations at Fordham University. And I've been covering the UN as a journalist for about 20 years at this point. To Save Us from Hell has its own separate podcast feed, but for the next couple of weeks, I'll be dropping episodes right here in the Global Dispatches feed. However, I'd strongly encourage you to search for To Save Us from Hell on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The best way to follow the new show To Save Us from Hell is by visiting globaldispatches.org. Unlike Global Dispatches, To Save Us from Hell is relying entirely 100% on paid subscribers. We are crowdfunding this new effort, and I would love your support. If you like what you hear today and want full access to all episodes of To Save Us from Hell going forward, please visit globaldispatches.org and get a paid subscription. I'd so love and appreciate your support in this new venture. Now, here is the debut episode of our new podcast about the United Nations, To Save Us from Hell. Enjoy. Welcome to Save Us from Hell, our new podcast about the United Nations. I'm Mark Leon Goldberg, a international affairs journalist, the editor-in-chief of UN Dispatch, and I run Global Dispatches.
I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an international relations scholar and an author at Fordham University in New York.
I am really excited for the debut of this weekly podcast in which Anjali and I will discuss news and happenings around the United Nations and the entire UN system. And it's going to be a good one. Welcome to our new show.
I'm really excited to be able to contribute to the conversation about the UN, which could not be more timely.
This is a project of Global Dispatches. To support our work, please follow the link in the show notes of this episode where you can buy a subscription to Global Dispatches, which will get you full access to all episodes of To Save Us from Hell. Each week, we are going to discuss some timely and important issues around the world as they relate to the United Nations and, of course, the latest news and events and happenings around the UN itself. And our debut is timely. As we speak, Vladimir Putin is being feted in North Korea by Kim Jong-un. They have revived a Cold War-era security pact, which has very big ramifications for the United Nations.
And in the last 10 days, we've seen action in the Security Council on the two worst crises in the world, Gaza and Sudan, including a rather heated confrontation on Tuesday between representatives of Sudan and the United Arab Emirates, who were pretty awkwardly sitting right next to each other the whole time.
And we'll discuss who should replace Martin Griffiths, the outgoing Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs who is leaving his post at the end of the month. Jan Egeland, who previously served in that role, joins the show to offer his advice for the next top UN humanitarian official.
So my successes were all good, but the principle of having hegemony for certain posts is wrong.
So, Anjali, you and I are sitting in our respective offices. Vladimir Putin is in Pyongyang getting feted by Kim Jong-un, rolled out the red carpet. You saw like rapturous applause at every gathering for which Putin attended. They are all in this new partnership between Russia and North Korea. And this actually has very big implications for the United Nations in general and the Security Council in particular. Just a little bit of a background here. This new alliance between Russia and North Korea is one of convenience. North Korea wants Russian advanced technological know-how as it develops its weaponry. Russia wants North Korea's decidedly very old and somewhat antiquated stockpiles of Soviet-era artillery that it can use on the battlefield in Ukraine. And indeed, a few months ago, we saw, really for the first time, North Korean artillery ending up on Ukrainian battlefields, and that followed a previous trip by Kim Jong-un to Russia. But here we are now, Putin in North Korea. This is a big deal for the UN.
It is a big deal for the UN, in part because, as we know, Russia is one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. It has a veto in the chamber, and it also is, in theory, one of the key enforcers of United Nations Security Council sanctions against North Korea. And so this puts us in a really complicated position vis-a-vis North Korea, vis-a-vis the legitimacy of UN Security Council action, and vis-a-vis the sort of possibility of UN Security Council action.
Yeah, let's be clear. Russia voted for a series of sanctions against North Korea over the last nearly 20 years, ever since North Korea first detonated or tested a nuclear weapon in 2006. And, since then, the Security Council had been the forum for applying pressure to North Korea to ramp down its nuclear activities, behave more responsibly on the international stage. And you saw over the last couple of decades just a series of increasingly forceful sanctions against North Korea for its nuclear program. And, as you noted, Russia voted for each of these sanctions regimes, or at least didn't block them. And now Russia is very directly violating the very UN security sanctions that it has imposed on North Korea. This is like a problem.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. As, longtime UN watchers or people who know something about the organization will know, we have this big post-Cold War thaw where the former Soviet Union, Russia, right, and the US start to cooperate on things like global sanctions regimes and UN peacekeeping missions and levels that are sort of unprecedented in the history of the organization. But in the last decade or so, basically following the sort of start of the Syrian civil war and Russia's use of the chamber to sort of start protecting the Syrian government, we've started to see cooperation at the Security Council grind to more of a halt on some critical issues. Critical issues getting with Syria, but carrying all the way through, obviously, through the two invasions of Ukraine, through to the war in Gaza today, and then now with the sort of increased Russian North Korean cooperation on the horizon, what we're really seeing is how the portfolio of the Security Council might be shrinking, how the places where the Security Council can be most effective and can agree to be most effective might be occupying a smaller and smaller space on issues of real importance around the world.
Yeah, this trip to me is the death knell of the ability of the Security Council to take any meaningful action on North Korea. I mean, it was getting more and more difficult over the years, particularly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where all the trends you described have accelerated. But it's also worth keeping in mind that while the track record is not perfect on North Korea, the fact is North Korea has not tested a nuclear weapon since 2017. This has been 7 years now. So at least in part, I think that's a consequence of a unified international response to North Korea's nuclear development that appears to be completely eroding right now. And the idea that the Security Council would do anything about, say, a future North Korea nuclear test seems really much in question now that you're seeing this closer alliance between Putin and Kim.
Yeah, I think one thing for us to keep watching is what China does in response, because China traditionally has been the key security partner for North Korea. That Russia is stepping up as part of a sort of politically convenient set of moves, I think makes us sort of pay attention to what China is going to do at the Security Council, because China, is a strategically pragmatic actor at the Security Council. It does not want to face Security Council sanctions, or it doesn't want to be sort of subject to the kinds of sanctions that Russia is courting or is under because of these moves, right? And so taking a look at what that kind of diplomacy can accomplish in the Security Council, I think, is going to be an important thing for us to watch.
And, most recently on June 12th, China joined Russia in trying to block a Security Council meeting dedicated to human rights in North Korea. Now, the vote was a procedural vote, so it's not one in which there's a veto. So the meeting happened despite Russia and China's objections. And I think their objection is more they don't like when the Security Council focuses on human rights in certain situations. But it was still notable. And also notable was the fact that in March, really in a harbinger of what is to come and what is really to befall North Korea at the Security Council, Russia blocked the renewal of the mandate of the panel of experts who are monitoring the sanctions on North Korea. Now, for those who are unaware, when you have a Security Council imposes sanctions on an entity, a country in this case, they will hire outside experts, independent experts who know things about financial crimes or smuggling routes, and they'll hire them to monitor the effectiveness of these sanctions. And this group now no longer exists. Their mandate has expired without renewal.
Yeah, this is one of those things that can seem sort of incidental, right? So often the top line story that we read coming out of the UN is what the Security Council did or didn't do. But one of the revolutionary functions of the UN system is these reporting mechanisms, right? These sort of big bodies that can provide multilaterally credible information and reporting about human rights situations, about arms control, about a whole host of issues that every country has an interest in knowing as close to the truth as possible about. So the fact that we're seeing sort of Russia being willing to step up and kill that kind of mechanism, that's not a great sign, right? It's not a great sign beyond the sort of traditional gridlock of the Security Council, which we expect based on the way that the Security Council is set up.
Yeah, I mean, to me, just bottom line here that this is the debut segment of the debut episode of our new podcast about the United Nations. And this could very well be the last time we talk about North Korea at the Security Council, just because I don't see any meaningful action happening at the Security Council on North Korea now that you have this real almost formal alliance between Russia and North Korea. As you mentioned earlier, this is just emblematic of the Security Council's ever shrinking portfolio of issues that it can meaningfully address, which is just a consequence of rising geopolitical tensions between the West and Russia and China. It's part of a trend, but also I think the most deepest manifestation of that trend that we've seen thus far.
We're in a space where the sort of big global institution that we have for multilateral action is going to have to weather a period of real geopolitical tension. And we're seeing that on so many fronts. And today, North Korea has entered the chat.
This is actually a really good segue into something else I wanted to discuss with you, which is actually meaningful action on Gaza and Sudan that we've seen at the Security Council. We're discussing the Security Council's shrinking portfolio, but over the last 10 days, we have seen the first meaningful action from the Security Council on the Israel-Gaza crisis and on the Sudan crisis, and both happened within short order of each other. I think maybe let's first talk about Gaza, and it's worth, I think, going through the TikTok of this over the last few days. And surprisingly to me, the timeline kind of starts with Donald Trump's criminal conviction in the state of New York on May 30th, which was a Thursday. That was all the talk of all the international news, political punditry. Then the next morning, Biden and the White House teased this surprise announcement about the Middle East. And that got everyone's kind of head scratching. Why is Biden going to talk about one of the most divisive issues in American politics and not jump on the Trump as a felon bandwagon? But he indeed announced a ceasefire deal that he said came from the Israelis, was sent to Hamas, that basically included a 3-part ceasefire. Phase 1 was an immediate 6-week ceasefire, followed by a permanent ceasefire, followed by reconstruction and some broader kind of political resolutions around the Israel-Palestine conflict. So as we speak, the status of these negotiations is unclear, but on June 10th, the Security Council took a vote and endorsed this Biden / maybe an Israeli ceasefire proposal, and did so in an overwhelming vote of 14 in favor and 1 abstention, which was Russia, which we can talk about in a bit. But I am curious to learn from you, Anjali, what is your big takeaway from this Gaza ceasefire vote?
So the resolution basically calls on Israel and Hamas to accept the US-led plan. It rejects the reduction of Gaza's territory and demographics, and it affirms support for a two-state solution in line with international law and in line with previous UN resolutions. And one way to look at this is to see it as the Biden administration trying to leverage the enormous support at the Security Council already from everyone except the United States, right, in favor of a ceasefire, towards building multilateral political pressure on the warring parties after months of mostly gridlock, right? So, this is a tactic that Kofi Annan used to use a lot, where he would sometimes announce a deal in advance of clear support from either party in order to build public pressure for the parties to accept that deal. And I obviously don't know what the behind the scenes are between the Biden administration and the Israeli government, for example.
Doesn't seem great at the moment, to be honest.
Doesn't seem great, right? And it certainly doesn't seem great given the response the resolution got from the Israeli delegation to the United Nations, right? But all of that points us towards thinking about a way that the Security Council chamber is being used as a pressure point to try and help build global consensus and pressure for this deal, which is sort of US-led, but globally backed, right? And that's sort of, I think, a really fascinating way to think about using that chamber, especially in light of having been the key obstruction point to previous ceasefire resolutions.
I totally agree. I think it really does demonstrate the utility of the Security Council in this situation. You give the patina, not just the patina, but the actual international legitimacy to what is essentially a U.S. ceasefire proposal and deal. And you have now the entire world supporting ostensibly this deal. And it's really up to the two warring parties now to withstand whatever pressure the world is applying to them and the international community is applying to them, as reflected in the fact that this Security Council resolution passed. It just adds political pressure to the warring parties in a situation where that kind of pressure has been to date rather muted.
I mean, and I think it also helps us see the limits of Security Council action, right? Because a UN spokesperson said yesterday that, more aid actually hasn't passed into Gaza since Israel agreed to institute the daily humanitarian pauses. And so building legitimacy and consensus towards something like a ceasefire is important. But at the end of the day, nothing but straight, repeated political pressure from Israel's key allies is actually going to make it accept the terms of the ceasefire agreement. I obviously don't have very much insight on what would make Hamas accept the terms of the ceasefire agreement, right? But in terms of what we see at multilateral diplomacy, it seems like we're seeing both the possibilities and the limits of what the Security Council can do here.
Yeah, a Security Council resolution is as good as the piece of paper it's written on if there's no political will to enforce it.
Yeah.
Just like Russia buying arms from North Korea in violation of Security Council resolutions. That just is one demonstration of the fact that these resolutions don't enforce themselves. They don't implement themselves. It requires political will to do so.
Yeah.
And, that's TBD on the Gaza ceasefire deal.
That's right. And I also think it shows us very clearly, right, both the North Korea situation and the Gaza situation, how dependent the Security Council's legitimacy and work is on the Permanent Five members, at least acquiescence, right? When they are the key stumbling blocks to action, we're not going to see enforcement, right? We're not going to see the ability to sort of operationalize these resolutions. But I think in particular, the Gaza ceasefire resolution also shows us the importance of the other members of the council, because elected members to the Security Council did so much groundwork laying those first sort of resolutions for a Gaza ceasefire beginning in the fall, beginning with the sort of first humanitarian resolution that Malta spearheaded, which was the first one the US didn't veto, right? Abstained on that one. We need to see that the Security Council is more than just those five, that the ideas about what can work and what can't sometimes have to come from members that don't have the same kind of veto power, but do have expanded ideas about security, about peace, about diplomacy.
And speaking about Malta, the Maltese ambassador to the United Nations, Vanessa Fraser, has been, I think, like the star of this Security Council session. When she speaks, when she addresses the council, people like stop what they're doing and actually listen to what she's saying. She has been just an absolute impressive and dynamic diplomat at the council these days.
Yeah, this is such an unusual feature of the UN system, right? That a small state like Malta can punch so far above its weight in terms of sort of diplomatic prowess, in terms of sort of like effect on humanitarian situations around the world. And it's a really fascinating thing to watch unfold and a real testimony to how good the diplomats that so many states send to the UN are.
So there's another bit of Israel-related news I think it's worth mentioning a bit, just because I think it demonstrates this downward spiral we're seeing at the United Nations between Israel, the Israeli government, and the office of Antonio Guterres and the Secretariat in general. So the background here is that every year, the UN Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict writes a report that kind of discusses broadly how children are faring in armed conflict around the world, whether they're being used as child soldiers or whether they're being targeted in unseemly ways. It makes for a grim reading, but it's one of those annual reports, happens every year. But there is always a bit of trepidation around the UN, because in addition to this report, there is an annex to the report that lists the countries that the special representative for children in armed conflict believe is violating laws related to protecting children in armed conflict. This is kind of known around the UN as the list of shame. Countries try their darndest to stay off of it. In fact, there is this anecdote from Ban Ki-moon's memoir in which he recalls getting a huge amount of pressure by the government of Saudi Arabia to keep its name out of the index for actions in relation to the conflict in Yemen. They were basically going to like suspend a lot of humanitarian funding. And he admits in his memoir to doing the politically expedient thing and not including Saudi Arabia in that list, fearing that it would harm the overall good of the organization. That's just like an anecdote that demonstrates how much countries want off this list. Well, needless to say, Israel made the list this year, and things turned very sour very quickly.
We had the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations released a video of himself, presumably answering the phone to the Secretary General's special advisor and explaining that Israel should not be on that list, according to him, right? And that the real sort of person who should be on this blacklist was Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
The only one who is blacklisted today is the Secretary General, whose decisions since the war started and even before are rewarding terrorists and incentivizing them to use children for terror acts. And now Hamas will continue even more to use schools and hospitals, because this decision, shameful decision of the Secretary General, will only give Hamas hope to survive and will only extend the war and extend the suffering. Shame on him.
And this is the kind of thing where the UN system has been a pretty clear object of the Israeli government's ire since October of this year. It also shows us, I think, a little bit about the power of these norms and values. Even so, the accusation isn't, oh, this list is meaningless, right? Or we don't agree with these values. The accusation is we shouldn't be on it because we're moral. And that's an acceptance of the underlying value. And that sort of shows us where the space for diplomatic action might be, even though the ultimate conclusion is essentially a bit of a showboating kind of, we don't need to be on this list.
And I just like this incident, though, of like the Israeli ambassador filming himself reacting to this and posting it on Twitter. Then Steph Dujarric, the UN spokesperson, kind of reacted strongly to that, kind of calling out the Israeli ambassador for posting publicly, at least his half of this conversation. And it just kind of demonstrates this downward spiral of relations between Antonio Guterres and the Israeli government. I mean, like the Israeli government, this ambassador has called on Secretary General to step down. Things are not good in their relationship at the moment.
I didn't realize that was actually a recording of his half of the conversation. I actually thought it was a reenactment.
It looks like a reenactment, but he's like professing that it's like a recording of his half.
Either way, I think it does show us something really interesting. Like, just as this is a unique forum for this kind of like high political stuff of countries talking directly to each other, it's also real political theater, right? Like at every level. And he would not be the first UN diplomat to record a video that didn't actually happen in real time to make a diplomatic point.
So I'm glad you brought up the opportunity for high politics, because we saw some very high politics this week at a Security Council meeting on Sudan. And the meeting that happened on Tuesday, June 18th, was about the humanitarian crisis in Sudan. But that followed a Security Council vote the week prior, in which, for the first time since the outbreak of full-scale civil war in Sudan in April of 2023, the Security Council passed a resolution calling, in this narrow case, for a cessation of hostilities and for a militant group, the Rapid Support Forces, not to attack the last major city in Darfur that they have not yet attacked, called El Fasher. It's a city of 800,000 at least. It's completely surrounded by this RSF group, which just happens to be the rebranding of the old Janjaweed group that carried out the Darfur genocide 20 years ago. So there is like high expectation that if this major city falls to the RSF, you're going to have a really horrible mass atrocity event. And the Security Council voted last week on the RSF to not go forward with this looming offensive.
Yeah, the resolution was basically calling for member states to stop arming Sudanese armed actors and demanding, as you said, the RSF halt the siege of El Fasher. And it called for an immediate halt to the fighting and a de-escalation in and around the capital city of Darfur. And that vote was 14-0-1. So 14 votes in favor, no votes against, 1 abstention, Russia. And they followed that this week with a sort of really contentious meeting. Part of this meeting today was a real set of arguments between the Sudanese representative to the UN and the United Arab Emirates representative to the UN. They were sitting next to each other, and the back and forth in this chamber was about the United Arab Emirates arming of the RSF, right? And the back and forth from Sudanese representative was essentially that the United Arab Emirates was showing up at this meeting despite arming the RSF. The United Arab Emirates counter was essentially that the Sudanese government refused to participate in the Jeddah talks that have been ongoing to try and negotiate an end to this conflict, with varying degrees of sort of frequency and success in actually assembling the parties. One thing that's notable about the resolution last week is that it doesn't call out any member states by name. It doesn't specifically say, for example, you, the United Arab Emirates, stop arming the RSF, right? That calls on member states to stop arming the factions of this war.
Even though we should note there is ample evidence produced by the UN, corroborated in media outlets, or vice versa, in media outlets corroborated by UN panel of experts, that indeed the United Arab Emirates is arming the Rapid Support Forces and backing that half of the civil war in Sudan. They are a partner in this conflict, not necessarily a partner in peace. And, I think that's why you saw just like this really awkward exchange, frankly, between the UAE representative and the Sudanese representative, because the Sudanese representative accused the UAE, rightly so, of fueling this conflict. The UAE representative shot back and said, didn't even call him the representative of the government of Sudan, but rather called him the representative of the Sudanese armed forces, which is the other belligerent of this civil war. It's the Sudanese armed forces versus the RSF. UAE is backing the RSF, and the UAE representative just called him the representative of the Sudanese armed forces, implying that indeed he is like a belligerent in this role. And frankly, he's not incorrect, right? These are our two sides of a horrible civil war.
Yeah.
But it was just fascinating to see that play out in the council this week.
Yeah, and usually when you get this kind of back and forth in the council, it's back and forth of statements to the sort of president and then back and forth. And you end up in these strange, stilted situations where the president will have to say, I thank the representative from X state for their thoughts after this screed, right? But in this particular situation, they were sitting next to each other. So they were turning to speak to each other, which is an unusual opportunity for these parties to face each other directly, which is at odds with the kind of delicate diplomacy a lot of people around the UN system are doing, where they're not directly calling out the UAE, despite, as you said, ample evidence that the UAE is actively involved in arming the RSF. We saw a little hint of this afterwards. I think during the press pool, a reporter asked the Secretary General's special representative about the UAE's role, and he basically made some noises and walked away, right? Because it is not the easiest diplomatic thing to engage in that public call out and have the private diplomacy work as well.
And it's notable that this conflict in Sudan erupted in April 2023, but it's not till now that we have any actual Security Council action on it. And I think that's at least a consequence of the fact that up until January 1st of this year, the UAE was a member of the Security Council.
Yeah.
And they're like a very effective diplomats. And frankly, the US needed the UAE and the West needed the UAE to help them on the Gaza portfolio. And Sudan, I think, fell by the wayside. But now UAE is off. The situation in Sudan is deteriorating mightily.
Yeah.
And so we saw this resolution penned by the British to essentially call for expanded humanitarian aid. And it should be noted that the government of Sudan, or the Sudanese armed forces, are blocking a key aid route from Chad into Darfur, just as their opponents in this horrible civil war are committing all sorts of mass atrocities. There's no like good guys here.
No.
In terms of going back to this idea that these, Security Council resolutions don't like enforce themselves, it doesn't seem clear that the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, are in fact relenting on their assault on this major city of El Fasher.
Yeah, it doesn't. And, in theory, right, Security Council resolutions are binding. When you sign up to the UN system, you agree to enforce the resolutions of the UN Security Council. You treat them as though they have the force of international law. Now, international lawyers tend to yell at me when I say this, right? But it is true that international law, its enforcement depends on the willingness of state parties. So it only exists insofar as state parties are willing to enforce it. And in that sense, because all international legal obligations are voluntarily adopted, all Security Council resolutions are voluntarily enforced. You have to be willing to step up and actually enforce the resolution that this 15-member council agreed on, whether you are a permanent member or whether you are another member of the UN system. So in this particular case, right, the resolution doesn't enforce itself. It depends, for example, on the United Arab Emirates deciding to stop the flow of arms. The RSF, it depends on the sort of partners of these armed actors pressuring these parties to step up and to protect the civilians of Sudan who are paying the cost for this war overwhelmingly, right? More than any other place, they're living in situations that are not getting the amount of attention they need commensurate to the humanitarian disaster that they are facing.
And I suspect that Sudan will be an issue that we revisit often on this new show for the fact that it is a rapidly deteriorating humanitarian crisis on the brink of one of the worst famines the world has seen since Ethiopia in the 1980s. It's really that bad, and it's getting worse. And on top of it all, the United Nations official who is most responsible for coordinating humanitarian relief in and around the world, including Sudan, is leaving at the end of the month. Martin Griffiths is stepping down as the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Emergency Relief Coordinator. It's kind of two titles for the same person. He's stepping down for health reasons. He said earlier, and it's been reported, that he's been suffering from long COVID. And he, after about 3.5 years on the job, is leaving at the end of June. And as part of his departure this week, Martin Griffiths penned an op-ed in the New York Times giving a rather grim overview of the state of humanitarian affairs around the world.
Yeah, his op-ed says, in his entire career working on humanitarian affairs, he's never faced a worse situation than he sees around the world today. And his op-ed, it places the blame on leaders for this. And it says the ultimate failure is a failure of leaders to their people. Just to sort of quote a little bit from the piece, he tells us that precisely the situation we see around the world right now with all of these global humanitarian crises, he says, this is precisely the situation that the modern global order, created in the aftermath of World War II and embodied with heartfelt ambition in the United Nations Charter, was meant to prevent. The suffering of millions of people is clear evidence that we're failing, he says. But he says he doesn't believe this failure at heart lies with the UN, because he says the body is only as good as the commitment, effort, and resources that its members put in. For me, this is a failure of world leaders, he says. They are failing humanity by breaking the compact between ordinary people and those whom power is vested.
I mean, on the humanitarian front, the UN is only as effective as the resources at its disposal, both financial, humanitarian goods, and also, political resources, the ability to cross battle lines or enter certain territories with humanitarian aid. And to me, the departure of Martin Griffiths and speculation over who might replace him is of such consequence at the United Nations because, these days, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, in my mind, is arguably the second most important person in the United Nations system behind the Secretary General himself. I think it's just for the fact that the ability of the United Nations to prevent conflicts and to manage conflicts has been muted as geopolitical tensions rise. So as a consequence, the UN is being turned to increasingly to look after the fallout of these conflicts, which is humanitarian crises and humanitarian disasters. And it is up to the top UN humanitarian official to coordinate responses, not only from across the UN system, but across NGOs, things like Save the Children and Oxfam. They all kind of work with the office of the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs to coordinate the responses to these crises around the world. So this position is really significant in the UN system.
Yeah, absolutely. We started out talking about how the political space for things like mediation in conflicts shrinks as geopolitical tensions between the P5 rise. But as that geopolitical space shrinks, as that diplomatic space shrinks, it doesn't shrink the fact that the UN remains the only organization that at scale can tackle some of these humanitarian disasters and serve this coordinating function. This is particularly the case because we live in a world where civil wars are lasting longer with fewer negotiated settlements and more cost to civilians. That's something we see international relations scholarship telling us, right? Volker Turk yesterday at the opening of the 56th annual session of the UN Human Rights Council noted that international humanitarian law and human rights norms are in decline worldwide in wars, right? With around the world us seeing civilians paying the blood cost for war in ways that are prohibited under international law, in ways that are prohibited by the resolutions of the UN Security Council, right? In ways that states sign on to preventing when they sign on to the UN Charter. And in the face of that, the UN's humanitarian work becomes increasingly important. It becomes the organization's biggest, most visible, and most vital role for people living worldwide.
It's like the most impactful thing the UN does these days.
Yeah.
And I think that's why there is so much focus and attention on the race to replace him.
Yeah. We used to say that peacekeeping was the signature activity of the United Nations system, right? But we're now 10 years from the last authorization of a new peacekeeping mission. And we can see in that the sort of decline of political resolutions to conflict. And in the face of that, what we see is humanitarian action becoming the signature activity of the UN system.
Yeah, if you were to ask me 10 years ago who the second most important figure in the UN system would be, I'd say it'd be the head of what was then called the Department of Peacekeeping Operations.
Yeah.
Now, no longer.
Yeah.
Can you just explain to listeners and frankly walk me through what is the actual process or procedure in selecting these top posts?
The selection process is not at all transparent.
So that's why I don't know it.
Yeah, it's necessary. It's not maybe not necessarily opaque, but it is opaque. So this position was established in 1991. It's a comparatively new position on the scale of UN positions, but it is one of the big positions that was traditionally reserved for one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. In a sort of big political grand bargain that characterizes all the different parts of the UN system, the Secretary General is never a member of a P5 nation. But as a trade-off, right, each of the P5 gets one of the big offices for one of their own nationals. And in the last couple of cycles, this office has gone to a British national.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of the office as being reserved for a member of the P5 is one that has gotten a lot of backlash around the world from countries in the global south, from countries who are the recipients of humanitarian aid, in part because the overall move of the UN system, especially under Antonio Guterres, has been about thinking about local solutions to problems. And it's very hard to adopt a local set of solutions to problems, people say, if the sort of lead actor on this stage is a British man. It is highlighting a sort of colonial dynamic that can look and be incredibly problematic. The flip side of that, of course, is that it's a way of investing the P5 in the process of humanitarian aid. And it's a way of putting in that position someone who can rally the richest governments in the world to try and contribute to the cause. And so there are real trade-offs when we think about what this informal system of reservation for the P5 does, and how the lack of transparency in how this person is selected enables the Secretary General to essentially play up what they think are going to be the most politically and operationally salient features of the job.
So since 2004 or 5, I can't remember which one, it was right around when I started covering the UN, every lead humanitarian official, every Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs has been British. Not only have they been British, but they've kind of been like the same type of Brit. They've all kind of been just very competent, skilled diplomats who rose through the ranks of either the British diplomatic corps or British government or UN system by dint of their competence and by dint of their ability to get things done. They've not been like household names, right? They've not been anyone that if you're outside the bubble, you've ever heard of in any other context. I just wonder if that's like part of the problem.
Yeah.
One of the key challenges facing UN humanitarian issues, and I put this question to Jan Egeland as well, is the fact that the requirements for paying for humanitarian relief and disaster recovery around the world are astronomical and only getting bigger as climate change takes hold and as conflicts last longer. The money available to pay for all that humanitarian assistance is getting scarcer and scarcer. So I just wonder if instead of like having a very competent, skilled humanitarian operator and skilled diplomat, you need someone whose primary skill set is fundraising and being like a more prominent political face of the UN.
It's interesting because another way we could think about that, right, is to think about the role that a politically visible person might play for fundraising. So if we take, for example, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, that person has historically been someone with a little bit more visibility, or someone who heads of state traditionally recognize as being someone on par with the UN Secretary General. So Michelle Bachelet is the classic case of this, right? Former head of state, someone with household recognition around the world.
Mary Robinson as well, Ireland's former president.
Yeah. Prince Zayed, right?
Yeah, Prince Zayed Ra'ad Al Hussein, who is a very senior Jordanian diplomat, member of the Jordanian royal family. Everyone knew him.
Yeah.
And now, you mentioned him earlier, it's Volker Turk.
Yeah.
But I'd never heard of.
Well, so he's done remarkable work around the UN for years, but he's not a household name, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it is the kind of thing where if we're thinking about what might balance the political role, Martin Griffiths talks at length about in his op-ed, but also, in other interviews he's given over the years about the importance of humanitarian mediation. How mediation, this political dimension of humanitarian aid and access, is actually key to success. And in that sense, someone with a more visible profile might serve the function of drawing attention to this job, also perhaps being able to rally countries to fundraise for it. Because I think the danger in looking for someone who's just good at fundraising might be that fundraising is a skill that, as organizations everywhere know, is not immediately transferable from charisma or from political savviness or from deep operational knowledge. And this position needs someone who can do all of these things, in part because we said just a second ago that peacekeeping used to be the signature activity of the UN system. The peacekeeping budget is separate from the UN's operating budget. It is a dedicated, separate budget that used to be larger than the UN's general operating budget, right? In some years, it was almost twice the UN's entire operating budget. It was still enormously small, right? At the peak, I think they were running 16 operations on 1/10 of all global defense spending. So it's like a rubber band level budget still,
It's like
right?
what the Pentagon loses in its couch cushions in any given year.
That's right? Like, you sneeze and you lose that at the Pentagon. But that was a dedicated large budget that was separate from the UN's budget that didn't rely on sort of like circulating the offering bowl every time there was a crisis around the world. And so thinking about like how to offset increased humanitarian need in a world of decreased willingness to sort of invest in multilateral organizations, I think it's a critical way to think about what kind of skill set this next leader might need to have. It harkens back to the decision to put a former head of state at the helm of the UN or a former head of state at the helm of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights.
So how would you assess Griffiths' record as Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs? I mean, to me at least, the signature accomplishment in his tenure was the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which permitted the export of Ukrainian grain from the Black Sea ports that Ukraine occupied, but a lot of the Ukrainian territorial waters around which were patrolled by Russian military. So there was this complex arrangement in which Ukrainian goods and grain would be sent to Turkey, where it would be inspected and then sent on to the rest of the world. And if you remember at the time, this came in the midst of real spiking food costs around the world and a real deep concern that Ukraine, which was a global breadbasket, would be unable to supply food, particularly to the developing South, which relied and required Ukrainian food. So this worked.
It was a huge accomplishment, and it's one that really relies on extensive, deep, quiet diplomacy over many months. The key piece on this is from last year. Colm Lynch had a piece in DevEx that went through the deep negotiations that went into the Black Sea Grain Initiative. One key connection here was Martin Griffiths' connection with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva, which does a lot of the initial backdoor negotiation. And it's a dynamic that we should see a lot in situations where the Security Council won't act because one of the permanent members is a key party to the conflict or a key stumbling block to action, which is that some group of diplomats did a ton of negotiation very quietly outside the umbrella of the UN. And once it was clear that that sort of diplomacy would take root, then the UN could attach its political capital and its sort of umbrella of credibility to the negotiations without necessarily paying the political cost up front for initiating the dialogue. And if at that point that dialogue didn't work, the UN wouldn't pay the cost for that. And that's something we know from watching him for the last couple of years that Antonio Guterres is very sensitive to. He doesn't like paying political costs for engaging in risky negotiations. And so something that we really see from Martin Griffiths' particular skill set, I think, is the ability to engage in that kind of quiet humanitarian diplomacy with other kinds of parties, and then to attach the sort of credibility of the UN to it.
There's just like a coda to the Black Sea Grain Initiative that's worth mentioning, which is that it died after a year. Russia pulled out of it. But incidentally, the impact on global food prices of Russia's decision to pull out of the agreement was not huge, for the fact that by the time that Russia pulled out, Ukraine had already secured militarily, through victories on the ground, a sea corridor for which it could export Ukrainian grain without having to negotiate with Russia. So Martin Griffiths did buy global food markets enough time in order for that sea corridor to be established.
And I think, not every deal is going to be a long-term success, but part of the effort of a humanitarian coordinator is trying to secure deals even when they might fail, because the short-term gain is worth it for people who are living under crisis. Next up, Mark interviews Jan Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council.
Jan Egeland, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
I want to kick off just by talking about the position of Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. But before we get there, why do you think that you were the last non-British national to serve in that role?
Because there has been a tradition in the United Nations, actually ever since the first Secretary General, which was a Norwegian, by the way, in 1946, that the permanent 5 nations in the Security Council would not have the Secretary General, but they would be having at least one Undersecretary General in a key position in the Secretariat, so-called, surrounding the Secretary General of the UN. So it's been mostly Frenchmen having peacekeeping. The Americans had administration, which is also the purse, and limiting the cost. The Brits had the political Undersecretary General. The Russians often had the director for all operations in Geneva, and the Chinese had the General Assembly, for example. Then there was a shift under Ban Ki-moon, and the US wanted another position. They got the political post, and then the Brits wanted to have the humanitarian post, which had gotten a high profile in my time as a humanitarian under Secretary General. And since that time, it's always been a Brit. I don't like this tradition of P5 having the unique privilege of having certain posts without the world being able to compete for these posts.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to limit the number of candidates, not to knock any prior Brit who served in the post, but when you're only choosing amongst a country, the quality of candidates from which you can choose is necessarily limited.
And it means you cannot then get perhaps a fresh non-Western view or a fresh Southern view on that job. But of course, Britain, thank God, has been an important humanitarian actor, and they do follow humanitarian principles. So my successes were all good, but the principle of having hegemony for certain posts is wrong.
So in your experience, what qualities make for a successful humanitarian affairs coordinator?
I think you have to be a courageous diplomat and advocate for people in great need.
Well, I remember having covered the United Nations when you were the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. You got in a bit of trouble for your outspokenness following the Indian Ocean tsunami. You sort of dinged the Western world and the United States in general for being stingy following that massive disaster. And President Bush himself came down hard on you.
I think that was a slight misunderstanding because the Americans interpreted the rich world as the United States, which it would be Norway having a higher per capita income, or the Gulf countries, or any Western
Oh,
countries.
so you're really talking about Norway. Ah, I see.
But I mean, it just shows that my press conferences at the time were really listened to. I remember the President Bashir of the Sudan, President Mugabe of Zimbabwe, President Bagbo of Ivory Coast at the time, Museveni in Uganda. They all attacked me for my outspokenness on suffering in their countries. And I was proud to have a Secretary General, Kofi Annan, that defended my right to call a spade a spade. So I think that using the pulpit of the United Nations on behalf of the downtrodden, those who are abused by armed violence and of neglect, that is one important quality. And another one is to really be a leader also for proactive action and immediate action, and get a diverse humanitarian system to march in the same direction is important.
Do you see there to be tension between being an active and outspoken advocate on the behalf of the downtrodden, as you say it, and also, on the other hand, the need to do the kind of quiet humanitarian diplomacy necessary to do things like, securing humanitarian corridors in wartime? You don't necessarily want to call out malicious actors when you, as a humanitarian, are trying to work with these very malicious actors to get to populations in need.
Yeah, I mean, you need to do things that are not counterproductive for the people whom you represent and speak for. But it's two different things. I mean, the emergency relief coordinator, as the position is called, is not the one sitting down to speak to the colonels in rebel armies or in government armies, for that matter. That is the local, national representatives of humanitarian organizations doing. In many cases, it could be the International Red Committee of the Red Cross, for that matter, which means that I think the main importance here of the position is to go to the Security Council, to go to world media, to go to heads of state and say, the way it is now, it cannot continue. Your side is killing as many civilians as any of the on the other side. Stop it, really. It's a little bit like in Gaza now. I mean, what Hamas did on the 7th of October had nothing to do with resistance or of occupation or anything. It was massacring innocent Israelis, but the totally indiscriminate military campaign that was actually done with indiscriminate American arms on civilians in Gaza is equally condemnable. So this is the kind of a language I think one has to have in place of the place, so that there is no doubt about what's really happening.
And you have seen Martin Griffiths indeed do that over the course of the last several months, issue very strong condemnatory language. I think of Martin Griffiths, and I think of you, and I think of Mark Lowcock and Valerie Amos and all those who have served in this role over the last couple of decades as being high-level, very competent diplomats who do the things that you just said, who are able to articulate condemnations, who are able to coordinate the humanitarian provisions throughout the UN system. One thing, though, that I think has been also perhaps the downside of the fact that you all have been very competent operators and diplomats is that there's been very paltry fundraising compared to the need. The humanitarian gaps have always been profound. And I do wonder, as we're facing this just ever increasing gap between what is appealed for and what is contributed, if like a different kind of person ought to be Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs, someone who's just like a prodigious fundraiser instead of a prodigious diplomat.
Perhaps. I don't think one person is going to convince the growing economies in Asia and for that matter in the Gulf to become as predictable donors as the Scandinavians have been for 40 years. I think that has to be the member states working in between themselves. I've been many times going to Gulf countries, I've gone to Asian countries, I've been going to these growing economies and trying to encourage them to be as much in solidarity with Burkina Faso as my own country has been for 40 years. We were giving 1% of our gross national income when we were much poorer than several of the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, for example. But there isn't that kind of a tradition. And I wonder if there are other mechanisms also to get the private sector more involved in providing funding. In our report from NRC, we pointed to the fact that 5% of the profit of the 5 largest multilateral private corporations would more than cover all humanitarian needs in the world of neglect.
So lastly, at time of recording, we don't yet know who will replace Martin Griffiths as the next Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. What advice would you give that person as he or she takes up the new job?
My advice would be to listen to a very competent staff that you have around the world and perhaps say which are the places where we are failing the most today. I did that myself when I took the job in 2003 and asked, which is the place on earth which we're really failing? And to my surprise, they said, Northern Uganda, where the Lord's Resistance Army, as it was called, created havoc. And I didn't even know there was this havoc there. So that was one of my first trips. And I called it the biggest forgotten emergency on earth. And we were able to reboot and strengthen operations there. So focus on neglect, try to get new donors on board, and be courageous, and don't have any of the great powers power you because you speak on behalf of people in need.
Well, Jan, thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Mark, that was super interesting. And I am really curious to know what you think the possibility of there actually being a non-British humanitarian coordinator is, as Jan England mentioned.
You know, it's like, because as you noted, this process is so opaque, it's really hard to make any sort of educated guess here. I mean, it would seem probably it'll be a Brit just because it has been, and there is some expectation that will be. But there's also like a good deal of civil society pressure. And frankly, Guterres, to his credit, has been responsive to civil society pressure over the course of his term against having a Brit. Even from groups like the United Nations Association of the United Kingdom. I mean, they have like this petition out, like, you know, don't ring fence the OCHA chief position for a Brit, open it up to everyone.
Yeah, another really interesting thing I thought he brought up was this idea that under Kofi Annan, he was empowered to call out heads of state as the coordinator.
And he got in trouble. Yeah. Oh, man, he got in trouble with George Bush.
Who didn't?
Yeah. I mean, like, he kind of mentions this in passing, but, you know, so like in the wake of the Indian Ocean tsunami, which people like forget now, but it was like a horrible, horrible humanitarian disaster and impacted dozens of countries around the world. You know, he kind of called out, or was, in his view, interpreted to call out the Bush administration for its stinginess in response. And George Bush himself like mentioned Jan Egeland and kind of dressed him down. And it's just like so odd for the president of the United States to single out like someone of the Jan Egeland level, like the head of the humanitarian affairs, which is not like the top position. You'd expect maybe he'd dress down like the Secretary General, but not like the OCHA chief. And that was just like a really weird power dynamic that happened at the time.
I love that even now he's like, who said I was talking about him? I was talking about Norway. Not my fault if you think I'm talking about you when I say rich people are stingy.
I've got to say, I've interviewed Jan Egeland a few times now, and he's like very direct. And I do appreciate that. He's not like one of those dissembling diplomats. Do you know the Jan Egeland song?
I have heard told of its legend.
So listeners may be aware of this group. I don't even know how to pronounce their name. Ylvis or Elvis. It's basically Elvis with a Y. They are most famous for the viral video, What Does the Fox Say?, which has like 1.1 billion YouTube views. But they have a lesser known hit called Jan Egeland, about Jan Egeland, or not really about Jan Egeland, about a fictionalized version of Jan Egeland who plays the role of like a 1980s action star defending human rights and supporting the United Nations around the world. The chorus is Jan Egeland, United Nations superhero man. It's a brilliant pain to a international civil servant.
There are so few of those that we have to celebrate the ones we have.
Drinking his protein shakes, spray tan, skin cream, and bodies like he was 18. He's a peacekeeping machine, and he stares into the mirror, flexing muscles in the night. And he says, boy, I think you're ready to protect some human rights. When this war and all is hell, bring it to England, the United Nations superhero man.
Thank you for listening to Save Us from Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us from Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.